going to do a little work on a fancy resonator guitar from another Canadian builder, another in our never-ending series. This is from Tony Carroll. Tony works in Mississauga, which is another city on the shores of Lake Ontario between where I live in Hamilton and Toronto. Here he is with a harp guitar of his own design. I've known Tony for pretty close to 20 years, I think. I first encountered his work in a music store in Oakville, probably 2002, which was coincidentally the year he became a full-time professional builder. He'd been making acoustics for several years prior to that, and solid body electrics for much longer. It was obvious at first glance that he was serious. You know, he had a beveled armrest and a sound port, and that may have been the first time I'd ever encountered a guitar with both of those features. We used to run into each other at various wood shows and through my work at Lee Valley and various luthiers events. A friend of mine actually won one of his guitars once in a raffle, which was subsequently stolen and then recovered. That was a big story. Tony's got some big names on his list of players. Bruce Coburn has one, as does Tommy Emmanuel. These days he does some teaching as well as building, takes on students in a part-time capacity. He's also a really nice guy, so I'm going to try not to make him hate me, because the owner of this guitar, which already has a pickup installed, wants an onboard preamp and a volume control. Now, Tony, like most builders I know, conceive of their acoustic guitars as acoustic, and they're not usually too happy about the idea of modifying them. And this is always an issue, and I certainly try to be sensitive. I don't want to be known as the guy who hacks up one-of-a-kind creations by independent luthiers. However, with my repair cap on, I'm also kind of called upon to make players happy and try and facilitate their vision as well as the makers. So it's a tightrope. This is a Dobro style resonator, and you can see it's built out of some really beautiful looking figured mahogany. The player is not wild about the sound port idea. We can debate the merits of adding a hole to the side of a guitar. I've done that before, and people usually get very opinionated. But in this case, I see it as the means of putting electronics in without intrusively changing the instrument. And in 20 years' time, if someone wants to reverse the work I'm doing here, it's not going to be an issue at all. And these are valuable instruments from a respected maker, and they may in fact accrue more value going forward. So I'm going to make an overlay that kind of conforms to the side here and doesn't require routing a big square or putting screws into it. There are a few other things that need doing. There's this strap button here, very tenuously connected to what is probably just the side wood, heavily figured side wood. It's not going into the block. Tony didn't do that. We're going to do something better. The action on this guitar is fantastic. It's set up very low for a resonator. It's actually around 5.5 64ths at the 12th fret, down to just over 4 on the treble side. The relief in the neck is good. It's around 7 thousandths. So setup is okay until we get to this end. I'm not sure exactly where I encountered this information. It may have been in an earlier iteration of Paul Beard's site, but there is apparently a minimum string angle necessary to make a resonator guitar function. And if memory serves, that's 6.5 degrees, which is quite shallow. You know, it is possible also to have too much angle, which can effectively choke up the sound, too much pressure on the cone. In this case, though, there is probably the minimum, except on these two top strings. And I don't know what's going on here, but the balls are just sort of sitting flush in the hole, and I feel like I'm a split second away from being sliced up when they let go. But more to the point, there is no break angle for those upper strings where they meet the bridge. They're just like running a straight line. So, I don't know, if it's too tight to allow the ball ends to go through, I might have to remount those holes a bit. And I'll do that, even if it messes up the plating, because that's not functional or safe. Let's start by removing this thing. Don't even need a screwdriver. Talk about things that might ruin your day. Anyway, we'll figure something out. Let's have a look at the back of the headstock here. Really restrained and kind of graceful looking little volute. Backstrap overlay. A couple of extra purfling lines. Nice. Yeah, okay, they do go in. One of the joys of working on these instruments is there's always a whole lot of screws to remove and replace. Don't lose any. Video making endeavors this month are going to be a bit of a challenge, as my carefully constructed schedule is in tatters. Doesn't happen very often. When it does, everything goes off the rails because I'm booked for months, right? So it means moving stuff around. I've had a couple of jobs with just crazy rabbit holes and major deviations. That's why you're seeing bits and pieces of work over several weeks rather than my more typical linear storytelling. Just I've had a bunch of guitars that need unanticipated finish work, which is really, it's a stupid thing for me to be doing at this time of year, but I don't really have much of a choice, and it just backs everything up while I'm waiting for stuff to cure. So, a bunch of jobs on the go. I know that many of you don't mind hanging around as I discuss several things in one episode. And frankly, it's kind of absurd that I've managed to put out so many videos, where there's a start, a middle, and a finish to a guitar project in each one of them. My friends don't know how I do this. So here we have the typical dobro style spider bridge, which contacts the cone at several different points. The cone itself is a disc of very thin aluminum, which has been mounted on a specialist lathe and pressed while spinning against a mold to give it this characteristic shape here. The thing you want to know about these is they're very fragile. This is very thin material. It's almost like aluminum foil, really, just one step up from that. So anytime you have to take one out of a guitar, we got to be really careful. Protect it at all costs. Baby it, put it somewhere where nothing's going to crush it or puncture it or deform it in any way, because they're not cheap. This is a Fishman Nashville series Rezo pickup. You can see it's split into two halves to accommodate the spider style bridge. I'll carefully undo the jack. Okay, this is a very simple jack, just the one lug for the hot leads and of course grounding to the case. So I'll have to get a different jack because we're going to need a ring lug as well for the preamp. Okay, I'm just going to cut these off because there's no way of getting this out. And like I said, I'm going to find a nice safe place to put the cone assembly. Having a look at the interior, everything is nice and clean. Well-fit brace ends, side stiffening battens, reverse kerf lining. Seems to be his 111th guitar. So I think my goal is to make an overlay style patch that's going to fit on the outside here and have two adjustable screw posts on either side, which will capture little clamps, not unlike certain sound hole pickups, to just hold the thing in. And I can put a couple of potentiometers and a little miniature preamp in there. Looking at this wood here, I'm not exactly sure what species this is. It looks kind of like Honduras mahogany with an incredible amount of curl in it, but it's also vaguely like koa. The closest thing I got in my collection is some African mahogany veneer that's kind of figurey too, which I think will look okay. I'm going to make up some laminations of black and that mahogany, and the entire thing is going to end up being probably 2.5 to 3 millimeters thick. So I'm going to have to make up a form as well to glue it against, so that it's going to conform to the curve of the side of the guitar here. I'm just going to laminate up a couple of pieces of the black first, a double thickness. It's still going to be bendable enough to get around the curve, but it'll be less fragile and easier to work with. Could be epoxy, but I'm using Tight Bond. Here we see the phenomenon that happens anytime you wet one side of a thin piece of wood. It immediately starts curling up in the opposite direction. Sometimes you can use that to your benefit when you're laminating things of sort of opposing densities and stuff, but main thing is to get it together quickly enough that that doesn't become a problem. Yeah, this is curling so much that I might actually want to put a spritz of water on the opposite surfaces, which keeps them sort of in equilibrium. This is black dyed, I don't know, maybe pear. I tend to think not, because it's a bit rougher than pear. It might be maple, possibly birch. You can see that little spritz, that it's evened right back out. Now, I'm going to put a bunch of clamps on this. Holding a piece of cardstock on the inside, I'll trace around the little oval. Here's a plastic profile gauge, which is made up of a bunch of little fingers held tightly together, which get pushed up and conform to the contour. Just making sure they're all lined up. And I will trace that. I transferred that to a piece of lumber which I cut out and sanded to shape, and I'm applying some packing tape onto the surface to act as a glue resist. I've got 2 double thickness pieces of the black veneer and a single leaf of the mahogany for the top piece. The grain is all running in the same direction, and it needs to be that way so that when I press it down to the form, it'll conform. I've mixed up some 5-minute epoxy, and I'm applying a perhaps overly generous coat to the 2 black sections. I'll get them centered where I want them, then I'll use some packing tape to sort of just hold it there. It's not quite strong enough to do the actual bending. For that I'll use multiple wraps of surgical tubing. This is my ugly tubing, the one which I use with epoxy, because it tends to get onto it and turn it into a really rough kind of messy material. Enough wraps of this, and legend has it that you could cut through an elephant. I'm not going to be so vicious, but what this allows me to do is clamp it without having to make a super accurate alternate piece which mates with the half that I've already got there. This is just expedient for a one-time jig. I'm gluing the template to the block here on the center line, so I'll be able to transfer those later on. Okay, I cut this out on the bandsaw and then sanded to shape using a disc sander. It's an awful lot of work for what's basically going to be a throwaway form, used one time. However, I'm dealing with an object here that is not like symmetrical. This is not a pure radius. It's based on the shape of the side, such that, you know, this thing only fits in one direction. That's what you got to do. Now I'm super gluing the lamination in place directly on the block, and I'll cut out around it to a very narrow margin, because this is an incredibly dangerous operation I'm doing here with a very small piece of wood, and I don't want a whole lot of material to trim away, so there's less chance for the bit to grab hold. On to the technical stuff. For the preamp, I've found this tiny little unit here made by our friends over at Shatton Pickups. It's called the Micro Pre. This one happens to be a single channel model. They also make a dual channel. Now, this, like any onboard preamp, needs a source of power. It'll run off a standard 9-volt battery. However, unless I mount it in a really inconvenient place inside the guitar that requires taking the cover off and the cone out and all that that involves to change it, it's just not going to work. What caught my attention is that this will also function using 2 CR2032 coin cell batteries. That's 6 volts and will give 750 hours of service, according to the instructions, which seems fine to me. The trick was to find a holder for the batteries that would fit into the allotted space. And I came up with this. this will allow battery changes from outside the guitar. As it is, it just barely fits in the opening in the guitar. Just. However, this is a weird diameter, and I'm going to need to drill a hole for it to fit in. And I have a drill bit that's 1 1/4 inches, which is about 40 thousandths smaller than the diameter of this, which is kind of annoying, but I'm sure I could file it out to fit. However, I got to thinking about this little housing here, and looking at it, the walls on it are actually quite thick, and I believe I should be able to resize this. So I'm going to do something crazy. I'm going to try and chuck it up on my lathe and shave that wall down to a depth of 20 thousandths on both sides, being the 40 thousandths I need, and that should be okay. This also has an integral on-off switch that protrudes out the side here. I'm going to cut that back because it's not necessary. It's just going to get in the way. Like most battery-operated preamps, they turn on when you plug in the patch cord. So I'll just leave it in the on position and cut that off. And to pair with that, I got a couple of little tiny mini potentiometers. One for volume, the other for tone. And this is all going to be a very, very tight fit. But I think there's sufficient room if I do some funny stuff. Okay, these leads of course will have to be cut shorter and pushed inside the housing, which is possible. And I'll put some pressure on the outside with the tailstock, and that should do me well. This is kind of a friction fit chuck. Definitely not something you're going to find in the metalworking kingdom. This is woodworking technology, straight out of the Richard Raffin playbook.
I used both square point and diamond point scrapers. This stuff is quite friendly to work with, actually. It felt almost like Delrin. I ended up with a nice lip, nicely machined surface, and right down to the 1,000th of an inch in accuracy. Hand turning. I felt proud. I'll scrape and sand to get rid of the excess epoxy which bled through the pores, and gave it a shot of satin polyurethane, and gently removed it from the form using a palette knife. The battery housing fits in perfectly. Quite happy with that. So I'll affix it in place with a little bit of epoxy on the reverse. So I wired everything up. Seemed fairly straightforward. I made the clamping mechanism, which is a piece of wood there which has been tapped for some 440 screws. I glued on some feet that have some cork on them to act as the clamping surface against the side of the guitar. While the glue dries, I'll turn my attention to the support block for the strap button. Make this out of a piece of Spanish cedar so it smells nice. And I'll taper it in 4 dimensions. Fit the front surface to the side of the guitar. And I'll glue it in place using a guitar string clamp. Some glue on the front surface. My little tuner clamp here pulls the string in tight and holds it in place. Then I'll affix the preamp assembly in the hole. Fits nicely, clamps securely. I'll solder the various wires to the jack. Making the wire connections inside the guitar for the pickups, etc. is kind of cramped. Needed the helping hands in there.
Well, this is infuriating because it's not working. I checked all of the connections, triple checked that I followed the diagram, tested the battery holder, tested everything else. I replaced the jack even, just to make sure it wasn't that. There's nothing shorting out. Everything's going where it's supposed to. The batteries are fine. I can't see why it doesn't work, but it doesn't. More to the point, I've had to take out and replace the cone and restring it a whole bunch of times to test it. It was always a little uncertain if I was going to break even on this job, but at this point I'm deeply in the red. I got $60 in parts, and at this point hours of labor with nothing to show. So I literally can't afford to keep trying things. Now I get to pull it all out and rewire the pickup back directly to the jack, and we're going to call it a day. Sometimes it doesn't work out. And I know that over the next few days there will likely be people trying to contact me to either second guess things I might have done or not done, or make suggestions. That's not necessary. We're done here. I won't be revisiting this and putting a bunch more time in. It is terribly frustrating for you, the viewer. It's more frustrating for me. I have the kind of mind that wants to track down everything and test everything and make it work. You know, having done that already, I have to stop because I need to focus on work that will pay me. We will, however, get to hear what this thing sounds like unamplified.